I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at the start of the Cold War. Obviously, World War II comes to an end, and you think society and the planet and the globe and the United States would have a break from tension and military buildup and fear among citizens. Unfortunately, that would not be the case. So, our objectives for this particular section would be to trace the reasons that the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union collapsed or collapsed, depending upon whether or not you're from the United States or the Soviet Union. Explain how President Truman responded to Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe. Describe the causes and results of Stalin's blockade of Berlin. Question one, the background of the Cold War. Why did the Soviet Union and the United States form an alliance during World War II? So before we move forward, let's take a little bit of a baby-sized step back or Clarke-sized step back. To defeat Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany, and because of a common enemy, the two nations had very little in common. So besides the fact that their enemy was Hitler, they didn't really have much that they would share in common. So when you think about kind of like an old expression, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's pretty much what the United States and the Soviet Union had during World War II. Also, too, the United States had much more trust between the Franklin Roosevelt-Stalin relationship than the Harry Truman and Stalin relationship. Two, compare and contrast the two government philosophies. Two forms of government. We have the United States in a capitalistic democracy or democratic republic, and the Soviet Union, which is a communist dictatorship led by Stalin at this point in time. I'm going to add that in there for you. Political ideology or beliefs. The United States had free elections, economic freedom, including the right to own private property, freedom of religion. Soviet Union, no free elections, no economic freedom, no right to own private property, and no freedom of religion. No religion at all. Philosophy towards governments of Germany and Eastern Europe after World War II. The United States wanted a strong, united Germany. Eastern European nations independently governed with independent and free elections in Eastern Europe. Nope. Soviet Union wanted a weak, divided Germany, control of East Germany, and wanted Eastern Europe to be Soviet satellite states. The big three had met at Yalta. And when they first arrived there, the big three said, "What's up, Yalta?" When you look at the big three here in February 1945, shortly before the death of Roosevelt, they had several ideas that came out of Yalta that became the post-World War II Europe framework. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin met at Yalta, which was a resort on the Black Sea. They agreed to recognize the Polish government set up by the Soviet Union. They had a declaration of a liberated Europe, which asserted the rights of all people to choose their own form of government. Germany and Berlin would be divided temporarily into occupation zones. You can see on the map. So the Soviet Union would control the eastern zone, the United States, the south central zone, and perhaps the largest of the zones. And then France and Great Britain would each control zones respectively. And of course, the French zone would be along the French border. Soviet Union, they really attempted to basically dominate Eastern Europe. After World War II came to an end, the Soviet Army, which had rolled through Eastern Europe in order to get into Germany, basically never left. They put pressure on Eastern European governments to establish communist governments in their countries. Soviet Union was supposed to pull its troops out of Eastern Europe. They did, but not until the 1990s. So they would wait another 45 years before they officially pulled them out. How did the Soviet Union come to dominate Eastern Europe? Soviet Union's army occupied Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia after World War II. These nations forced by the Soviet Union to install communist puppet governments that were friendly with the Soviet Union. You can see Stalin there putting the little Soviet flags into those Eastern European spots. You see the map on the left is a red map of all the Soviet bloc countries under the control of Stalin and the Soviet Union. So basically what the Soviet Union did is they basically indirectly governed these countries made him communist and had to remain communist throughout the Cold War from 1945 through 1990. How did the Potsdam Conference between Truman and Stalin impact relations between the countries? And here's the first time that Truman met Stalin. They didn't really like each other from the start. Truman and Stalin walked away from the meeting with less trust for each other. Some believe this marked the unofficial start of the Cold War. Photograph there to the left, Winston Churchill, center, Harry Truman, right side, Joseph Stalin. Seven lists 4 Cold War issues that became a source of concern during the late 1940s into the 50s. The arms race. The United States had already developed the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union was looking to do so as well. You also had, eventually, they're going to look to expand upon the power of the initial atomic bomb. They have hydrogen bombs, nuclear bombs. Space race. Both sides were looking to increase satellite technologies and potentially, eventually, orbit the Earth, potentially put the first person on the moon. Desire to spread their ideology, democracy and capitalism versus communism. And then they would begin to fight proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam. Proxy wars are where the United States and the Soviet Union do not declare war against each other, but they support the other sides that are fighting in the war. So, for example, both Korea and Vietnam are divided up between communist North Korea and democratic South Korea. Vietnam similarly is in communist North Vietnam and democratic South Vietnam. And when those two countries go to individual, basically civil wars, the United States supports the democratic sides in North Korea and North Vietnam respectively. The Soviet Union and China, which turns communist in 1949, they support the communist sides. 8, explain Winston Churchill's quote from his speech on March 5th, 1946. He stated, "An iron curtain had descended across the continent." Eastern European countries saw the Soviet Union take indirect control of those areas, installing the communist puppet governments there. Europe was divided between democratic Western Europe and communist Eastern Europe. There's Churchill there. The Iron Curtain, you can see there, kind of the map there. The orange, dark orange color would be the Soviet bloc countries. Now, there's a video link there. I have that posted on my virtual classroom, my Bitmoji classroom. If you go into the files for the Cold War, you'll be able to find that speech from Winston Churchill. So I encourage all those who are enthusiastic about learning more about the Iron Curtain speech and Winston Churchill to kind of explore that clip. Any of the links you see here that are posted, including the one that'll be here in a moment for Truman, that's also posted in on the Bitmoji classroom and the files under the Cold War. 9, lists several facts about Harry Truman's background. He's from a small town in Missouri. He was a World War I veteran. He was a haberdasher. If you know what a haberdasher is, that's a person who works like in accessories for like fine dressed men's suits and accessories. He was a county commissioner in Missouri, which got his his political career started. He was a U.S. senator and the vice president of the United States of America for about 65 or 70 days. President Truman's favorite quote was, "The buck stops here." Explain the meaning of this quote. While as president, he believed he was responsible for all policy decisions and actions that the government took. So therefore, if something went wrong, he wouldn't look to blame others. He would look to blame himself. He would have said that I should have done a better job. I could have known a little bit more about the issue or made a little better decision. So he wasn't one to kind of push the information off on somebody else. Okay, let's take a look at additional things here that I would want to comment on. Examples of presidents who tend to accept responsibility. President Kennedy, later on in history, we're going to take a look at Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs, he made a terrible mistake. He authorized a covert operation to try and remove Castro, the leader of Cuba, from power. It was a failure. People lost their lives, and he went on national TV and took responsibility for the bad decision. President Nixon, he got caught. He tried to cover things up and blame others. Both President Clinton in the 1990s and more recently with President Trump, they tend to blame others for issues that are plaguing their presidencies. Okay, question number 11 is based on a speech that President Truman gave before a joint session of Congress. A joint session of Congress is when both the House and the Senate are in the congressional building in the Capitol. And the president gave a speech there, and this is just an excerpt from the speech, obviously not the entire speech, but Truman stated, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States of America to support all free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures," meaning communist governments like the Soviet Union putting pressure on their government. "I believe that we must assist free peoples to work on their own destinies in their own way. I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid, which is essential to the economic stability and orderly political processes." Harry S. Truman before a joint session of Congress in March of 1947. So the purpose of this address was to persuade Congress to give Greece and Turkey $400 million in aid. Truman's word choices helped support this purpose by painting a negative picture of communist forces threatening Greece and Turkey. For example, Truman describes that threat of communism as the will of the minority forcibly imposed upon the majority, and states that communism relies upon terror and oppression and the suppression of personal freedoms. He also warned that Stalin's regime would flourish in the evil soil of poverty and strife. He believed the United States and our allied countries needed to be united in supporting nations around the world who were attempting to resist the spread of communism. Explain the significance of the Truman Doctrine. So a doctrine is when a president issues a broad policy decision for the country and kind of tries to guide the country down a particular path. In the case here of the Cold War, the United States, he believed, must support governments threatened by communist takeover, such as Greece and Turkey. In order to contain the spread of communism, the United States would provide aid and assistance, initially financial assistance, maybe military aid as well. This provided the framework for the American foreign policy during the Cold War. So when we look at Harry Truman's presidency in the context of the next 45 years in American history, he's going to really establish a lot of precedents. Precedent is a tradition or a broad policy for the country. And the Truman Doctrine would definitely be one of those things that the United States would think about, future presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, all would have Truman's Doctrine in the back of their mind as they governed the country during the Cold War. So when you look at the two broad policies of the Cold War, the first is the Truman Doctrine. The second will be, which we'll be discussing next, is the policy of containment. First of all, George Kennan, he was an American diplomat to the Soviet Union. He worked in the American embassy in Moscow, and he was probably the most experienced and perhaps the foremost expert on everything to do with the Soviet Union in the 1940s. Kennan believed the Soviet Union would only expand where it knew it was certain to prevail. They weren't going to risk losing a military conflict just for the sake of expanding, but they would exploit weaknesses such that if they knew they could easily overrun a place and install a communist government, they would time and time again. In Kennan's long telegram, he put forth an idea. He advocated keeping communism within its present territory with political, diplomatic, and economic, as well as military actions if necessary as a last resort. This became the second key component of American foreign policy during the Cold War, a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of the Russian expansive tendencies. That's a direct quote from Kennan. So the policy of containment, for me to sum it up in a little easier way for you to understand, is that the United States, moving forward, would accept communist domination in Eastern Europe, but we would not accept any further expansion of communism around the world. We would go in and try and stop it from occurring. Now, we're not always going to be successful, and the first test of the policy of containment would be a failure. But generally speaking, this would be our guiding policy moving forward. "14. Why was Secretary of State George Marshall so concerned about the devastated Western European economies?" Well, first of all, remember George Marshall. Let's take a step back. He was a gentleman who was put in charge of the buildup during World War II. Franklin Roosevelt had trusted him with coordinating supplies and price controls and everything that was necessary to get uniforms and supplies to the military, and coordinated efforts on the home front as well to prevent price gouging and deal with some of the shortages and stuff like that. So he was really very well experienced. So Marshall felt that if nations did not rapidly rebuild in the aftermath of World War II, this could turn into a situation where totalitarian governments or communist governments could be the solution to the problems in the nations struggling in the aftermath of World War II. Several countries after World War I turned to totalitarian forms of government to address their problems, and Marshall feared that we might have a repeat of history. So he proposed the European Recovery Plan, which was nicknamed later on the Marshall Plan, to give billions of dollars in aid to European countries to help rebuild their economies. So if we could be the big brother or the parental figure to kind of help out the struggling Western European economies, then they can perhaps prevent them from turning to communism. If you look at the map there, the bigger the dollar stack, the more money that was received from the United States during the Marshall Plan. You can see, obviously, a lot to Great Britain and France, but a significant amount to places like Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, West Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, as well as Ireland, and a tiny bit to Portugal and Iceland. And you can see that money that went down to Turkey and Greece, that $400 million that we had mentioned before, did eventually get into the hands of those countries. So the help from the United States weakened the appeal of communism, because if they're getting help from the United States, they don't need to go to Stalin and the Soviet Union, nor do they need to turn to communist form of government to address their issues. Because of a lot of the differences between the two different groups, primarily the United States and the Soviet Union, eventually Germany is going to be divided. The British, French, and American zone are merged together into one zone, West Germany. The Eastern German zone is controlled now by the Soviet Union and becomes communist. But the capital city of Berlin is completely contained within East Germany. And then Berlin is split between democratic West Berlin and communist East Berlin. So it's going to be very difficult, as we're going to see here, to get supplies to West Berlin here in 1948. So if you look at Berlin here, you can see my arrow pointing. You can see Berlin in the black and the red. The red is the East Berlin. The black is the black is West Berlin and democratic. All the red here is East Germany. So here's the three zones before they're merged together in the yellow, blue, and green. Eventually, this all becomes West Germany. But for the time being, they cut off all transit from the western side into the eastern side. So there's no way to get in by train or truck, car, whatever it might be, supplies into West Berlin, which begins to starve. So the United States and our allies come up with what is remembered as the Berlin Airlift to address the issues of the Berlin blockade. So let's take a look at questions 18 and 19 and 20. So 18, why did the Soviets blockade Berlin in June of 1948? Well, this was in response to the Western countries' refusal to grant reparations to the Soviet Union. They naturally thought that because the Germans had done a lot of destruction in their country, who had seen the rubble from Stalingrad, they thought that just like after World War I, after World War II, they would get reparations. They did not. So they cut off all road and rail traffic into West Berlin. And since Berlin, as I alluded to before, is completely in the Soviet zone of East Germany, the West could not bring supplies into democratic West Berlin along the ground. So President Truman came up with the Berlin airlift to kind of lift in by plane supplies into West Berlin. For 11 months, cargo planes supplied Berliners with food, medicine, and coal during the winter. Stalin finally ended the blockade in May of 1949. The Berlin blockade by the Soviet Union convinced the American public, which was uncertain as to whether or not Stalin was trustful or not, to fully distrust him, determining that the Soviet Union was bent on world domination. So this is kind of a change, a permanent change in the American mindset of the average American citizen in their view towards the Cold War. How did the Soviet blockade of Berlin, rather number 21, what does NATO stand for? Why was it formed? And how does it impact society today? Remember, it's NATO, not NATO. It stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is a mutual defense alliance that included initially 12 countries, including the United States, Canada, and much of Western Europe. Formed in response to the threat posed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The motto of NATO was, an attack on one would be considered an attack on all. Today, NATO includes 28 countries, and it combats major threats to collective security today. Soviet Union was concerned about the NATO organization, so the Soviet Union created its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. This was basically the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. It's satellite countries that they controlled and dominated throughout Eastern Europe. This is to counterbalance NATO. Lesson reflection question. How would the policies outlined in the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment influence presidential decisions during the Cold War? Well, one thing it did is it put forth the idea that presidents need to back up words with actions. So you can't put forth big policy doctrines or decisions without being willing to back it up. Future presidents were forced to aid countries resisting the spread of communism. The United States got involved in both the Korean and Vietnam Wars as proxy wars to stop the spread of communism. And during the Cold War, military budgets dramatically increased because of the arms race. So hopefully this gives you a good foundation understanding of some of the early events and the foundation of the Cold War as you move forward in the days and weeks and months to come, because basically as we get into the Cold War now, the Cold War is going to last until May of 2021 in terms of our class, or whatever year this video might be viewed. Basically, the overview of the Cold War is going to take place between now and pretty much the end of the school year, as the Cold War lasts until the late 80s into the early 1990s. Hopefully you enjoyed this presentation, and until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.